Disclaimer. During this podcast, we will be discussing topics that may not be suitable for children and can be triggering for people. We will be talking about physical and sexual abuse, mental health and suicide, as well as addiction such as drug and alcohol abuse. Listener discretion is advised. This project is supported by the Edmonton Arts Council and the City of Edmonton. Wajay, welcome to the Reconcile Me Not podcast series. My name is Aretha Graytrix, and I am Cree from Quechua First Nation. I'm a filmmaker and content creator. Reconcile Me Not is an autoethnography research project examining reconciliation and my role as a storyteller. I am a granddaughter and daughter of a residential school survivor, and I'll be sharing my research along with my experiences. I've invited my mother also to share her stories and experiences as a TB sanatorium, 60 scoop, and residential school survivor. She is also a retired federal employee who worked in multiple departments for over 30 years. Welcome, everyone, back to our podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about the Indian Act and Indigenous identity. I would like you to join me in welcoming my mother back to the podcast. So, Mother, introduce yourself and tell us something about yourself and how you started working for the federal government.
My name is Christine Solomon, and I'm from a Quechua band. I've worked for the federal government for 30 years, and the first government job I started was with Indian Affairs.
How did you get that job?
There was a lady that wanted a Native person with Cree speaking as a first language, and that's how I got interviewed for that job, and that's where I started working for Indian Affairs.
Did you learn anything about yourself working for the federal government?
Yes. With the federal government, I'm a very shy person, so I was that was my way of learning how to deal with people and get and enjoying that was really enjoyment job for me, is dealing with people.
Because you started out working for Indian Affairs, which is now called Indigenous Northern Affairs. And one of the jobs that you had worked in was registration, of helping people get registered under the Indian Act to be considered Indigenous or First Nations, or status under the Indian Act. So can you tell me how many categories of Indigenous registration are there?
The only ones I've worked with are probably about 4 categories. It was very simple. So there's 6 1s and 6 2s, and depends whether 1 or 2 or A, B, and C. Those were the categories I first learned about how to dealing with registration.
And because the Indian Act itself gets amended and changed and stuff like that, do those categories and do those sections change, and are they added and amended?
A lot of them have been added and some of them were deleted.
So according to my research and looking up and just attending other things and just actually looking on the government website, if you look under the government website, there's 2 sections. There's 6.1 and there's 6.2. 6.1 is if both your parents were entitled to be registered. 6.2 is if only one of your parents was entitled to be registered.
Yes.
So under 6.1, because there were so many laws that decided whether or not you gained or lost your status, like Bill C-31, which is if you are a Native woman who married a non-Native man, you lost your status. And that's because it was the belief that you were your husband's property. So you are what your husband is. So the moment you married a non-Native man, you became basically whatever your husband was.
Not an Indian.
Yeah. And but if you were a non-Native woman who married a Native man, you gained status.
Then you became an Indian.
Yes. Or you became status under the Indian Act.
Yeah.
So because of that, Section 6.1 has all these subcategories of how you can become status. And one of them is you can also adopt a child. If you adopt a child, or if they're under 18 and you adopt a child, they also can gain status and you can pass your status on. So each one of these categories has specific requirements that allow you to pass on your status or not. 6.2, I believe, cannot pass on your status.
No.
because basically they're saying like, oh,
It ends there.
Yeah, it ends there. But 6-1, there's the special categories or special circumstances that you then can now pass on your status.
Anything with 6-1 can pass on their status, whether it's A, B, or C.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that was confusing to me is because technically I have a parent who was, I only have one parent who is entitled to be registered, which is yourself. My father is non-native. So I should have been a 6-2, but because of the new requirement, as soon as you became, because you were Bill C-31,
Yeah.
but you gained your status back. So when you gain your status back, they now passed a new law where they have the Bill S3, where now I can pass. I'm not actually passing on my status. You're passing on your status to your grandchild. So instead of just being able to pass on your status to one generation, you're able to pass it on to a second generation. So from that, I think now, and I'm not even 100% sure because we don't ever see these classifications. This is all internal records at Indian and Northern Affairs. We don't see this. We just see if we're status or not. And so if I understand it correctly, I believe that I would be a 6-1C1. I think. I'm not 100% sure. I think before that Bill S3 came in and the 1951 cutoff date was removed, I think I was a 6-2.
Yeah.
But because of the new requirements and the new additions and the amendments, I think I'm now a 6-1C1.
Yeah.
Because you're a 6-1C.
Ever since they removed that 1951 deadline.
Yeah.
It's now changed. Your category is now changed to a 6-1.
Yes. Okay. So one of the things that I find interesting is because you have things like the 1951 cutoff date and you have the Indian Act. The Indian Act actually determines who, because they create these subcategories of who can and cannot have status. They then work with the bands who then are supposed to maintain the lists. So my understanding, and this is where I get confused, is to me, it sounds like there's two lists. It sounds like to be Indigenous, you have to meet these requirements to be registered under the Indian Act. But then you also have a band or a reserve that has a list. So who determines who is on the band member list?
Well, for INAC, they said that you're automatically on a band list. Now they have band lists for the bands. They're the ones that decide who they want to be on their band list. See, I don't know. That's what I was told because I remember the Indian Act saying everybody's on the ban list once you're registered. Because that was the first that I remembered being told this when I was working for Indian Affairs or Indigenous Affairs. Now there's a different story. People are talking about ban list, the one that's on the reserve. They're the ones that would have their own list, ban list from the reserve.
Mm-hmm.
Because people don't really know who's really on the ban list. But again, the band, I believe, sends that list to INAC.
Mm-hmm. And
it shows whether that person is on the ban list, on the one on the reserve. But I'm not sure how that really works. It changed.
Mm-hmm.
All I know is Indian Affairs, once you're registered, you're on the ban list.
Because
it is so confusing.
Mm-hmm.
You don't really know until you phone the band yourself to see if you are on their ban list. That's what people are doing.
And I think the thing that I find that I think gets confusing amongst a lot of people is the whole concept of is like, I'm Indigenous, here's my status card. But the thing is, to be a status person with a status card, you don't actually have to be Indigenous. Because even though Bill C-31's, so what happens is in the 80s, 85, right? 85, they basically said, okay, we shouldn't do that. So they undid it. And so anyone who lost their status due to marriage gained their status back. Yes. So you gained your status back. Yes. That's how I have status, because you had gained it back. And so, but the people who had gained status prior to that from that same like requirement or whatever, they didn't lose their status. So you actually have a lot of people who are non-Indigenous who were just married into it and gained status, but they never lost it. In that requirement, you then had two parents who were status. And then because of that, they were able to pass, because you were under 6-1, you were then able to pass your status on to your grandchildren, even though technically they were the same as a 6-2, which was technically one of their parents, because of that law, if that never existed, never would have had that.
Yeah.
So that's why Bill S3 came in to say that's not fair. So now the parents who had lost that, and it's only people who are Bill C31s, Bill C31s now can pass their status on to their grandchildren. And so this is where it kind of gets confusing, because if we think about it, we have this concept of having status means and proves that you're Indigenous, and it actually doesn't.
No.
Because you also can adopt children, which again is kind of a gray area, because, there are people who were adopted as kids who grew up very Indigenous, raised in, and a lot of our communities and our nations actually have ceremonies that you are actually adopted into your family.
They call it Indian adoption.
Yeah, it's like it's a whole ceremony that you go to that actually like your whole community adopts them into their community. Yeah. But if we think of like blood relation, we're not actually related. But I think that's where we have the concept of, in our communities, we're not like, it's not only about blood relations, it's about connections. It's about family connections, of whether your family accepts you, whether your community accepts you, which is a totally different thing. Through that same process, you have people that, I guess, kind of knew how to game the system and knew what to put and not to put on an application so that you could pass on your status to your children.
A lot of women do that. They will not mention their dad.
Yeah.
Because this is where a lot of them, and most of them, are non-status, their fathers.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a reason why they do that, because they know right away that it'll be a different category for their child.
Yeah. And they wouldn't be able to put their child as status if they put who their father was. So they just leave the father out of that application.
Yeah. A lot of them do that.
This is where, whether being Indigenous and Indigenous identity is actually very complex, and we can't use the status system to determine who is and isn't Indigenous, because it's kind of like a political identity at that point that is determined by the government, whether or not you qualify to be Indigenous according to their records.
This is where you start doing a DNA testing and who you related to, and how this is how people have to prove themselves now if they qualify. If they don't know if they qualify, that's an example. They have to find out at least someone from their family if they were registered back in the 50s, or,
I don't know if it'd be DNA, because I don't even know if you need to be like, I guess so. That's like paternity, like paternity or maternity.
That's what they're doing.
Not like the 23andMe DNA list, not those things.
Not those.
Because that's a totally different thing. But even then, it's more so about connection.
Yeah.
But even in that system, it's flawed, because a lot of our reserves, not all of them, but we have a lot of examples, because one of the things I always say is I would never want to work for a band office. The politics on a band office is so, I've heard horror stories. And the thing about it is band lists are maintained by the band office.
Yeah.
And if the band office doesn't like you, they can remove you from this list, because it's their discretion of who is on and not on this band list.
Yeah.
Is there ever a circumstance where someone is Indigenous or status as defined under the Indian Act, but they're not on the band list because they've been removed?
Yes, there's some, because they'd come to me. They would come to me and say, why am I not? I was on the ban list. Now I'm off the ban list. I get that at Indian Affairs, So I turn around and say, well, it's up to the band. They're the ones that removed you. Indian Affairs can't really do anything about it. It's up to the band, whatever band list they keep.
Can it happen the other way around too, where you are actually non-status, so you're not eligible to be status, or you're not a status member, but you're on the ban list?
No, not that I know of.
So,
I wouldn't know.
if it's the sole discretion of the band on who is on the list, could they put anyone on the band, or do they have to be status?
I'm pretty sure they have to be status because that's how they do their distribution of treaty monies.
Mm-hmm.
That's the only thing I could think of is once you're on that, because that's the ban list that they use for treaty payments.
Mm-hmm.
Is that ban list that you have? That's how you get your treaty money. So obviously the person must be registered, must have a treaty number.
And I guess
so I don't really know. It's so
confusing.
Yes,
right? So I guess if you're not even entwined in that world of understanding that there's the Indian Act and there's status and non-status, and then there's treaty, which you think that they're related, but they're not.
No, they're not, because there's some reserves that don't have treaty, like Wigwamacon. That's not, they don't have treaty, and their status.
Well, and so if you look into the history of when the treaties were signed, so there are 11 treaties across Canada. And so basically what happened was Canada wasn't even fully formed country yet. And at this point, the Queen, so that's Crown land, had signed treaties with Indigenous people to say, hey, we want use of your land. We're going to give you these things, and you're going to give us basically dominion over the land. So you were going to sign over the land to you, but we're going to share the resources with you, and we are going to pay you and basically share. And so the Queen of England made these treaties with each territory. So there are 11 treaties in total. The treaties also aren't all the same because different requirements were happening. And then also, the agreements changed based on what they had to offer. Like where we live, they have something called cows and plows. And I believe it's between one hand length or something like that. And basically it was because they were farmers. They were farmers. Yeah. So they said, we're going to farm the land, and we're going to give you money for a cow and all the things that you need to farm the land. Now, a big settlement just happened not too long ago where they realized that they hadn't actually paid people out their cows and plows. So they all got cows and plows money, which is so funny because even between Indigenous people, they don't even understand that not all these agreements are across all the treaties, because we don't get cows and plows.
No.
We weren't farmers.
Uh-uh.
We were fishermen.
So we have trapping.
Yeah, we have trap lines, and when we fish.
Yeah.
Those are two ways that
that's our treaty rates.
Yeah, that's our treaty rates. Also, the treaty payments were anywhere from $2 to $5 per year that you paid per person on this ban list. As inflation happened, that number never changed.
No.
Now, I always thought, and maybe you can tell me differently, I always thought that we got $2 a year.
I've never seen $2. I've always seen $4.
Is it 4?
Yes.
Because I looked it up. It said it was anywhere between 3 and 5, and I could have swore it was 2.
Wow, I've never seen $2. So I've always been for here.
Well, here it's 5.
But yeah, because I did that when I do the treaty payments on the reserves here in Alberta. They're all $5.
Okay,
that's the treaty payment they have. In Ontario, it's $4.
Yeah.
That I remember getting.
Needless to say, either way, I didn't actually get it because you had to actually go to your community to get your money. And I never went because I've never actually set foot on my own reserve. And so I think you've claimed for me and someone else has claimed for me that I don't know, because they just changed a system not too long ago where you can fill out paperwork and they will now send you your treaty payment. And so when they sent me my treaty payment, it was like $40. And if I'm thinking about how old I was at the time, I'm missing money. So even if you had taken money for a long, long time, actually it wasn't even $40. It was like less than half. Like I'm missing a lot. And I think that's why they did it as well, too, because you used to have to fill out this form, go into the office, say, here's my treaty money. Like, here I am. Here's my thing. Can you have my treaty money? But then people were going and forging signatures and saying, I'm collecting on behalf of these people, because you used to collect for us.
Okay, this is what happens.
But you didn't collect every year, though.
Yeah, this is what happens when treaty payment started. Like, let's say my dad would go pick up the money. The person, whoever it is that's handing out the money, would list all the people that he has under him. He can collect that money. They let the family sign for you and collect your money.
Mm-hmm.
That's what a lot of them are doing. Even when I was doing the treaty payment here in Edmonton, in Alberta, same thing. They collected all their families, like their father, the mother,
Mm-hmm.
their siblings, or their children. A lot of that was happening, and you had to sign it. You had to just put your signature in it or your.
But they realized that was a problem because people were collecting when they didn't have permission from that family member to collect on their behalf.
That was a big problem.
So now they don't have that. And I think they're slowly improving the payment and how you get money.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, the biggest issue that I find is that at the time, I'm sure $5 or even $3 or $4 would have been a lot of money when these treaties first were signed. This would have been a lot of money. That money has never increased with inflation.
No, it hasn't increased since I was 15. I remember getting $4. I was 15. I was still getting $4. And now I'm 74. I'm still getting $4.
See, and I always thought it was $2. So I'm like, okay, apparently we get $4. Okay, so $4. Okay, so right now we have people who are on a band member list. What happens, let's say that everyone on this band list, what happens if something happened to them and they didn't update the band list?
If they didn't, you mean to tell me if they deceased? That's the biggest problem. A lot of bands, a lot of reserves don't really check their band lists and send that up-to-date listing so that Indian Affairs can have their up-to-date listing, the deceased ones, and the ones that have left the reserve and moved and transferred to another reserve. Those are not updated, and they get funding even for a person that's deceased. That's the problem with the band list. A lot of people do not update their band list for the deceased people or from the people that have been transferred out into another reserve.
If we think of how our communities work, like Cree, my understanding is Cree is matriarchal. So you are supposed to be what your mother is. With that understanding from an Indigenous perspective, you then should have gone to your mother's reserve because we live in a very patriarchal society, and that's what the Indian Act was based on, and that's what the laws were based on. You then were registered under your father's.
Yeah, if you married, let's say, well, my mother, I'll give you an example. My dad is from Fort Albany. Mm-hmm. My mother is from Moose Factory Band. Now, they got married. You automatically will join your husband's band without any say in it. You don't have the right. You're just automatically you're married into that band. That's what happened. My mother's originally from Moose Factory Band, Moose Cree Band. Now she's with Albany Band.
Okay. Why did I think she was a member of Attawabascat?
No, she's not a member of Attawabascat.
Was one of her family members a member of Attawabascat?
Probably the family members from Attawabascat.
Why did I think that?
Her mother is from that area, Attawabascat. And also her mother also is part of CCB because she married into that band. So it's really confusing. It depends what band you're in. But she ended up marrying into this band. That's why she came into Albany Band. You're automatically out of that reserve. It is. But that was in those days now. Now you have two bands. This is different now. Now if I'm married, let's say there's a man in a different band and the woman in a different band, and they have a child. Right now, this is how it's working. It's up to you who you want to register with, your mother's or your dad's reserve.
Mhm.
This is happening now. Before that, it didn't happen.
And you can also leave your band and register with another band, but two things have to happen.
Yeah.
Your band has to be willing to let you go.
Yeah.
And the band that you want to go to has to be willing to accept you.
Those are the two things.
But you don't have to have a connection to that band.
No. You don't have to.
So if we wanted to, we could have left our band and registered with a band here.
Yes.
They would accept you.
So
okay.
If they accept you, that's a number one.
Mhm.
Okay.
And I guess, so with the Indian Act was created, but it was created kind of secretly while treaties were being signed, because they're not the same thing.
No.
The treaties determine that people will get access and will share the profits from this, which is your treaty money, the benefits you get, all that stuff. But the Indian Act was then created to determine who those people are. Yeah. It's not who's Indigenous and who's not. It's who will benefit from those lists. And that's what the Indian Act did. But in the Indian Act also then created the band system, right? Because they were the ones who said, these are the people we're going to deal with and who are going to maintain and create reserves. Because we did not live on reserves.
No.
Reserves were created later. And then within those reserves, then chief and council were created to determine who is going to speak on the behalf of that community. In that sense, I think that's where people get kind of confused, that there's treaty, there's the Indian Act, and then there's Indigenous identity, which are kind of intertwined, but they're not all the same thing.
Wow.
There have been a couple times in history, including, I've heard people say this even now to this day about getting rid of the Indian Act.
Yes.
But the problem with that is that they're currently the only system we have in place to determine who is and isn't status. And I'm not going to say who is and isn't Indigenous, because that's a different thing. Who is and isn't status, and who's going to benefit from those treaties, unless we come up with our own system that's going to identify who is and isn't Indigenous, or who isn't a member of that treaty system, that treaty that we sign, and who's going to benefit. I don't think we can get rid of the Indian Act.
Nope, I can't see it. Because it's going to be a big problem, because without that, we're probably going to end up losing our reserves.
And the biggest problem is currently some of our reserves just happen to be on land that's actually has a lot of resources on it. And I think at the time, if Canada had known while they were creating the reserve system and putting us on the reserve, if they had known that they were placing communities on top of oil money, if they were placing communities on diamond mines, if they were, if they had known that they were putting us in places that there is like rich resources there, they never would have put us there. They were trying to move us to places that were out of the way.
Yeah, we're all out in the boonies.
Well, they tried to. I just think they didn't know that where they were putting us was actually very lucrative. And because even with our communities, like I said, we didn't live on reserves. We were actually very nomadic people. We moved with hunting. That's why a lot of our communities, like if there's two reserves or two communities that are next to each other, we kind of like most countries, we borrowed from the other country, because if we didn't have words for certain things, that's when we started, like even our language. I always say we're from Ontario, so people think that we're Ojibwe, and I'm like, no, we're Cree, but our dialect is actually OG Cree. I would never consider myself OG Cree.
I've never heard of that. That's the first time I've ever heard of that, OG Cree.
Yeah, so Ojibwe and Cree mixed together. Yeah. Because when I'm here, I'm like...
Which is true, though.
Yeah, it's because we're surrounded by Ojibwe people.
Yeah.
So we probably did a lot of intermingling with the Ojibwe people there. Yeah. And because of that, our language started to meld together a little bit.
Yeah.
Like if I'm talking about an Indigenous person, I grew up saying they're real Nish or Anishinaabe.
Yes.
Which is technically Ojibwe. It's not Cree.
Anishinaabe is Ojibwe, really.
When in fact, our what we call the people is Ininu or Ilulu.
Ininu or EU.
Yeah, Iuishte,
Yeah.
Ininu,
There's about three.
Ininu and Ilulu.
Yeah, there's about
and the
three.
difference between all of them is one's N dialect, one's L dialect, and one's, is that Y dialect?
There's a Y dialect, yeah. NY. What'd you say? There's NY and L.
Yeah, and that's all within the Hudson Bay James Bay area.
all
That's why even our treaty, although it's called Treaty 9, is also referred to as the James Bay Treaty, because in that section we're all Cree, but there's three actual different kinds of Cree that are there. So again, it's one of those things where we were very nomadic people and we moved around. We moved where the hunting was. We have really cold winters up there. Like we lived off the land in a different way than say someone out here in the prairies. In that sense, we were all very different in what our needs were and how we do things.
Like for instance, like in Ontario, Hudson Bay, our number one famous meal is goose. Goose is number one meal in our area.
Because we didn't have buffalo.
We didn't have buffalo or deer. What we had moose. Maybe we did have deer. I'm not sure.
Caribou.
Caribou. I mean, right? Caribou. I think it's caribou. And there's moose and geese. Geese is our number one meal during the summer. And then, and fish. We do a lot of fishing. Fish and geese are number one.
Mm-hmm.
Wintertime, it's moose meat or beaver. We have all those different rabbit.
Do you think if we were to replace the Indian Act now, what would we replace it with?
Well, like AFN.
Well, and this is why I'm saying, because
you would need another Native organization that can work with Indian Act or replace the Indian Act.
Yeah, I think unless there's a system that we create, because the Indian Act was not created by us. It was created by the Canadian government.
Canadian government, yeah. We didn't even have a say in it.
Yeah, we didn't have a say in it. They were just like, hey, we've passed this act and it's called the Indian Act, and this is how we're going to identify who you are.
Yeah.
That's why Indian Act and being Indigenous identity is not the same thing, because it was the government telling us who we are and identifying who is and who isn't eligible to be status, not who is and isn't eligible to be Indigenous, because that's not the same thing. Because the Indian Act also doesn't apply to the Inuit, doesn't also apply to the Métis.
No.
Which is their own distinct communities. But also within that whole process, it also excludes non-status. And then we also have the groups that are disenfranchised, who basically, for whatever reason, weren't where they needed to be when treaties were signed in their territory. So they are not part of them. So they are disenfranchised communities that aren't actually part of the Indian Act. And we have some of these communities that are now working with the government to create modern day treaties to then be a part of the Indian Act and basically being recognized as a reserve. It is very complex in those systems. And all of this happened because the government, like the church, decided they knew better on how to handle the situation. What were we going to do? We weren't even allowed to be lawyers, doctors, or anything, because those were circumstances, or join the army. Those were circumstances that if you took in those careers and got educated, you also lost your status. Yeah. So any moment you decided that you were going to better your life or even join their system with being educated, they were like, okay, that's fine. If you're going to do that, you're no longer Indigenous. Because of that, we have all these systems in place that were created without us, without our input, without consultation, without even determining if we felt that that was right for us.
We were left out.
It was a very paternalistic process to say, listen, we know better than you. This is a system. Trust me, it'll work. And you didn't even ask us. You just said, this is a system.
Take it or leave it.
Take it or leave it. I think if we were going to do something like that, we would then have to do the work to create that now. But I think the way it is now, we have 5 federally recognized organizations, and they all came about because we saw this oppression. We saw people that were not being treated fairly on the reserves. They were put in deplorable situations. And then people out of necessity would then leave the reserve, lose their status to join Canada, join the Canadian way of life because of the situations that were happening on the reserves. And so because of this whole system that was basically was created out of oppression, 5 national Indigenous organizations were established to advocate to represent Indigenous people. Currently they are the Assembly of First Nations, the Congress of Aboriginal People, the Métis National Council, and the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, and the Native Women's Association of Canada. And each one of these were created because out of necessity, because of what we needed to advocate for Indigenous people, because we recognized that needs were different. So AFN was supposed to be for status people that were on reserve, because those are the bands and the reserves. Each one of those representatives is basically the chiefs of all the reserves and bands. And they then represent the Assembly of First Nations, which is all First Nations across Canada. Now, First Nations does not mean Inuit. So the Inuit community up north has 4 distinct regions that then represent ITK. And I'm going to say ITK because it's easier for me to say than Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami. And they represent the 4 regions up there. Now, majority of Inuit people live up there, but there are Inuit people that live outside. And then we have the Native Women's Association, because we recognize that all of these systems and everything that's happening is very paternalistic. So we needed a representative to advocate for Indigenous women specifically. So then the Native Women's Association was created. And then the Congress of Aboriginal People originally also included Métis, but eventually the Métis decided that they wanted their own voice and their own community. So they created the Métis National Council. But then the Congress of Aboriginal People was created for people who are off reserve and non-status. Now we say unaffiliated Métis and unaffiliated Inuit or Southern Inuit, because again, if they're not part of those 4 regions, then they're not associated with ITK. But we have Assembly of First Nations that says that they represent all status people, although they're not doing too much for off reserve people. But then they're not going to represent non-status either. So again, each one of these organizations has specific people that they're advocating for, because at the end of the day, we're all Indigenous. Everyone who's part of this group is Indigenous, non-status, unaffiliated Métis, off-reserve status people. We are all Indigenous, and we all have different needs that aren't being met. And so in this whole concept, it's like, who represents us? And to be honest, I feel like the way our system is right now, we are very divided, because the current government is doing a distinct based approach, meaning they only want to work with nation to nation. And they're identifying that as the First Nations, the Métis Nation, and the Inuit. Because that they're only wanting to deal with those 3 categories, they're excluding a whole group of people, especially since there's a lot of data out there that tells us that majority of people who are status live off reserve. Who's going to advocate for us? And because we're doing that, it's kind of saying the way they determine how resources are distributed amongst Canada to help all Canadians, they're determining it by who Assembly First Nation says they represent, who ITK represents, and who Métis Nation represents. But if they're saying they represent us, but they don't actually do anything to help us, then what are we going to do? And I feel like each one of these 5 organizations plays a very important role in that process. And I think if we were going to create something to replace it, it would take all 5 of these organizations to put aside their arguments of who is and isn't a rights holder and actually worked with one another for the benefit of all Indigenous people. I think we could do it. But I also think that's never going to happen. I think there's a difference between people who generally want to help and people who are willing to let go of their ego. And I don't think that's going to happen.
Too much competition.
Mm-hmm. Now, with all that information that we've just shared with everyone, where do we talk about and how do we then start the conversation around Indigenous identity? In self-reflection, what is my own identity? I think from talking and speaking with elders, one of the things that I learned was that in Cree culture, that you are what your mother is. And so I've always identified with being Indigenous. And it was actually from conversations with people that I had to really think about what my identity was. And I think growing up so my mother is Indigenous and my father is white. Even in being white, like I didn't actually know anyone from my dad's family. I didn't grow up with them. I think I met my grandmother. From my memory, I remember meeting her for the first time when I was 19, but I did see a picture of me when I was younger. I didn't remember it. So I knew that, that I'm English, I'm German, I'm Swedish, I'm French, from my father's side. But I also always knew that I was an Indigenous, and I always felt caught between these two worlds of being Indigenous and non-Native as well. It was through these conversations with people that I knew who I was. And I always found that I had people in my life that were trying to tell me who I was and put their perceptions of what my identity should be on me. And then eventually I just came to a point where I had enough. And I was like, no, I'm going to tell you who I am. So most times if you ask me, I will tell you I'm Indigenous. I sometimes will tell you that I'm half white and, that I'm English, German, Swedish, and French. Sometimes I'll tell you that. But most times, no. I think because it always feels like you need to choose a side. And for me, I grew up being Indigenous.
You know why? Because you were always taken home. Ever since you were a child, it's all First Nations that you're dealing with all the time. You're meeting a lot of my relatives, and you're mainly grew up in the Indigenous way because you were always on the community where all the reserves are, and relatives are all mainly, most of them are status. So that is what you're dealing with more than anything else, because you're not really on the non-native side, because you never really grew up with a non-native side, because I'm a First Nation person, and that's how my children were raised.
And I think that's it, right? Like I was raised as a First Nations person, so I identify more with that. I know when I went to school, sometimes I can be a little passing. So I know I can be, I'm a little bit lighter. You can tell I'm something, but sometimes you can't tell what I am. And so when I would say I was Indigenous, people would be like, oh, really? Okay. And I'm like, well, I'm half white. And they're like, oh, okay. So you're Métis. And I'm like, no, because to me, I grew up around Métis people as well. And I know that Métis is its own culture. And I don't know Métis culture because I'm not Métis. But sometimes Métis is used to be mixed. And it kind of has been used as this catch-all term. Whereas there's a lot of discussion around who is and who isn't Métis. And I know, like for that example, like someone was trying to put the Métis identity on me. And I'm like, I'm not Métis. If you make me choose, I'm First Nations. That's who I was raised to be. That's the culture I was brought up in. I'm First Nations. My own identity, I've had to come to a place that I was very comfortable with that. For me, at the end of the day, I'm Indigenous. My mother's Indigenous. My grandmother's Indigenous. My grandfather's Indigenous. My dad is non-Native. His family was non-Native. I love genealogy. I love learning about myself. And I don't want to ever seem like I'm not proud of my non-Indigenous side, because I am too, which I know, like we had a cousin who did genealogy and did research. So I can trace my family back very, very far on my father's side. I know that, my German side, I know they came from Gotha, Germany. He was a shoemaker that came to Canada, I think in the 1500s. I know just from our research and things like that, I know that I'm a descendant of William the Conqueror. Me and the Queen of England were like distantly related. Yeah, I love learning about, my ancestry. For identity and my Indigenous identity, I am very solid in that. And I've never questioned it. I do know the only struggles that I've had is that we don't live in our territory. And although there are Cree people here, they're actually different Cree people from where we're from.
Yes.
And even our culture and our teaching and even our languages are slightly different. Mm-hmm. They're similar, but slightly different. And so I probably learned more about Cree culture here than I did back home. I still have access to that culture that I still I grew up with, but I didn't understand the full teaching behind it. And the more and more I'm actually learning more about the teachings and going, oh, I knew that. I grew up with that. I knew that teaching. I just didn't know what it was called, and I didn't know it was a teaching, but it was just a belief system that was in the foundation of how I was raised. Your blood quantum and status are not the same thing. No. It's not the terminology we use, and it's not based on that system. This whole system has been created, and it's the system that we have.
Yes.
And unless we come up with something better to replace it, we can't just remove it.
No.
Because our whole identity and membership and who is and who isn't status is based on the system. So we would need something to take it over. In saying all that, one thing that I hope that our listeners take away from these discussions is what did you learn today? Did you learn anything new? Did you learn anything new about Indian Act, blood quantum, status, non-status? And I encourage you to have these discussions with your family members or do your own research into your own family. And for me, identity is about a lived experience. I'm an Indigenous person because I was raised as an Indigenous person. Now, not to say that reconnecting people can't also have that, but you also have to do the work to figure out, because there's no such thing, and I say this all the time, there's no such thing as Indigenous culture.
No.
There's no Native culture. There's no, like, that is such a catch-all term that doesn't exist. There's Cree culture, there's Blackfoot culture, there's Dene culture, there's Mi'kmaq culture. Each one of our tribes and nations have our own culture, customs, and traditions. And so if you're going to be reconnecting, you need to know what it is you're reconnecting to. You can't reconnect to Indigenous culture. You have to connect to your culture. And first and foremost, you need to figure out where you're from. I would encourage people to do that if that is something that you're interested in, but also learn about your other family. Like I said, for my non-Indigenous side, I love genealogy. We actually hired a genealogist. That's why I know so much information about my dad's side of the family. And I love to learn about culture and where you come from and your ancestry. So it's always good to know who you are, because then it just helps you solidify your own identity. I would encourage everyone to do that.
Yes.
So thank you so much for listening today. And of course, thank you, Mama, for joining me. Much appreciated. And we will talk to you next time.
I certainly will.
Kitchi miigwech.
Sagi din.
Nila sich. Waje.
That's it.